Večeras jedan bitan i fascinantan film, jedan od onih filmova koji određuju tok razvoja jednog žanra ili podžanra na period pre ili posle njega. Film koji je vrlo specifičan i po svom sadržaju i po svojoj dramaturgiji i po svojim etičkim dilemama. I večeras imamo privilegiju da gledamo čak integralnu verziju tog filma, koja je sat i 10 minuta duža od standardne. I ja sam prisutvao nekim projekcijama tog filma, znači koliko god da traje, prođe za čas i razgovor sa autorom je podjednako zanimljiv. Josh, please. Autor filma Joshua Oppenheimer. Your certain audience, movie professionals, movie lovers, human rights professionals, human rights lovers, perpetrators of political crimes, I'm sure, victims of political crimes. And among these people, at least one person who is very dear to you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming to this Serbian premiere of The Act of Killing. Don't need a translation? Really? Can I have a show of hands who needs a translation? Because I don't want to lose you. This is a very, very meaningful screening for me. I'm here tonight presenting the film with my teacher, my mentor, my friend, one of the great filmmakers in the history of cinema, a man who has pioneered the space between fiction and documentary, between reality and fantasy, and a man without whom I would not be a filmmaker, and nor would I have the courage to explore this dark part of ourselves. Dušan Makavejev.
Nisam, prevario me, ja nisam, pretpostavljam da će ovako nešto kaže. Ali, tako da malo sam se zbunio, ali imao sam u nekoliko klasa raznih ljudi i zanimljivih studenta na Harvardu, a 1997. godine se desilo nešto neobično. On je napravio film koji se zvao Kompletna istorija otkupa Luizijane. To je dokumentarni film koji nije imao nikakve veze za Luizijanom, ali je bio neverovatno neobičan i uspešan. I čak se desilo da Harvard, koji ima jednu specijalnu nagradu koja se zove Hoops Award, to je jedna nagrada koju dobijaju zajedno profesor i student. I tako tu sam saznao da postoji takva nagrada i podelio, znači, s njim. Mislim, ja znam da treba što pre da počnemo da gledamo film, zato što je vrlo dugačak, ali sad treba da ipak nešto kažem o njemu. On je bio lider antiratnih protesta i čitavih, vrlo imao jednu lidersku ulogu koju se lakoćom sprovodio u toj masi tih prvorazrednih studenta. I jedna je bila, ali recimo radio stvari, on se ubacio u neku grupu nacista kao njihov pristalica, to je potrošio određeno vreme na to, a uspeo je da ih ubedi da je on vanzemaljac koji je bio poslat na zemlju, jer su primijetili da je to bilo važno, to što oni rade. To je recimo jedna od njegovih stvari. Jedna od drugih stvari je bila kad je došao s jednom grupom, bio je neki reakcionar držao predavanja, on je došao sa grupom, svi su bili obučeni kao kaluđerice i opet taj se predavač raspametio, zvao policiju i imali su probleme, bili su izbačeni iz tog predavanja. On je posle toga tužio Harvard sudu zato što mu nije dozvoljeno da bude obučen kako on želi da bude obučen i dobio proces. I sad, znači, s takvim čovjekom nije njega lako podučavati, nego u stvari od njega naučite više nego što vam pada na pamet, što bi moglo da vam pada na pamet. Tako da je to bila i jedna zabava imati takvog studenta i on je bio i stimulacija za sve klase, za druge klase ili za cijelu klasu studenta. Ne znam da se treba što kažem, ali...
I won't say very much about the film. You are watching the director's cut of the film. It's almost 2 hours and 40 minutes, which means it's about an hour and 10 minutes longer than your average full-length documentary. So prepare yourselves and pace yourselves. Please stay for the closing credits because the last piece of the story lies there. And I'll just say one more thing. The whole tradition of cinema is really dominated by movies about good versus evil. Good guys versus bad guys. But good guys and bad guys only exist in movies. In reality, every act of evil in human history has been committed by human beings like us. And we have very few films about how we commit evil, why we commit evil, and the effects of evil on ourselves and on our societies. The Act of Killing is such a film. It's also, I hope, a film about what it means to be a human being much more broadly, about what it means to have a past, about how we create our world through stories, and how, as a crucial part of this, we use storytelling to escape from our most bitter and indigestible truths. I won't say enjoy the film. It might not be that kind of film, but you are welcome to laugh. Indonesian audiences do, and many other audiences do, and they get just as much out of it. I won't say enjoy the film, but I wish you a powerful, even a magical experience. Thank you to Beldocs. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Dushan.
We could skip now these basic details and get right away into a more personal, wider, broader, more lateral discussion. Would you start with questions, please?
Yeah, I was hoping you would notice the many names that are unknown. Yeah. And it's a little different when the lights come up during the credits, but that's the final blow for many viewers because they realize that this is still the situation now and that it's unsafe that people risk their lives to make this film. And the crew, my Indonesian crew, would all come from, I would make sure that everybody was from another region of Indonesia. Indonesia is a vast country, so that they were also, so that if you didn't know their full, you didn't have a reference, a list of their names, because they're often in the same networks, then it would be very hard to find them. But that's why, that was what I was hoping you would notice. And I should just thank my Indonesian crew, including my Indonesian co-director. These are people who gave a decade of their lives to work with me, risking their lives, knowing they could maybe never take credit for their work. They've been my friends, my family. I'm very grateful. I wish they could be here to meet Dushan tonight.
I have a question. First of all, I have to say it's a remarkable movie, really, and very brave. And I'm so interested in how you, first of all, get to that idea. Second of all, how you explain your idea to them. And I mean, it's a very delicate subject, and it could come to the snapping of the main actors, you know, like a snapping. Especially in those scenes, you know, they could be aggressive, and as we all know, Indonesia is a quite like gangster country, and I mean, you put your life in risk because of that, so everything could happen. So I'm interested in how you explain to people and
how do you persuade them?
Yes, how did you pursue them to act, to play in the movie, and to repeat the whole history, and so open.
In fact, when we hear from perpetrators, should I repeat the question? Would that be helpful? Yeah. He asked first how I found the story. Maybe in the interests of what Boris said, I'll touch on that, but I won't go into detail because it's something you can read about. It's true on the website and in numerous articles. So we'll save the time that we have together for other things. But I was also asked how I persuaded them to make this film and what I told them and what the relationship was. Normally when we hear from perpetrators, they deny what they've done or they apologize for what they've done. And the reason for that is simple. By the time we approach them as perpetrators, they've already been removed from power. But here's a place where the perpetrators have won and are still in power and have not been condemned by the international community or human rights discourse, because basically the genocide, the military dictatorship which followed, the use of gangsters in politics, that is the West's vision for Indonesia. Western companies make use of gangsters to break strikes and to clear land and to keep workers in sweatshops afraid. So here's this situation where the perpetrators have won and have mythologized crimes as something patriotic and heroic. This is nothing new. It's Oscar Wilde who said that patriotism is the virtue of the vicious. He's right about that, of course. I think that I would argue, though, that in fact the normal situation is when perpetrators win, that all of our societies are built on episodes of mass violence. I'm an American. My country is based on the Holocaust of slavery, over 100 years of apartheid, the genocide of the Native Americans. We have a whole Hollywood genre dedicated to celebrating that. It's called the Western. Not to mention imperialism in the post-war period, and earlier. So all of our societies are based on episodes of mass violence that are glorified as heroic. And in fact, even I now live in Denmark, which is a very comfortable, nice place to live, and we treat each other well, and we have the lowest inequality in the world. And yet, even in Denmark, everything that touches our bodies from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep is haunted by the suffering of the people who make it for us. And the clothes I'm wearing, the microphone I'm speaking through is haunted by the suffering of people in sweatshops who make it for us. And we know that, and we are dependent on other people's suffering for our survival. And we're all much closer to perpetrators than we like to think. So if I were to ask, the American President Andrew Jackson, who was involved with killing the Native Americans, to tell me how he did it, he would be very open. And he would celebrate it and say it was a great thing. So too with these men, they were open. I didn't have to trick them, I didn't have to lie to them, I didn't have to euphemize. I didn't have to say, tell me about your heroic struggle, because for them, words like exterminate, kill, as you see in the talk show, in the film, for us, they have a genocidal nuance. For them, they have a heroic and patriotic and nuance. And so all I had to do, I began this journey working in collaboration with a community of survivors. Every time we would film together, and I'll gloss over this quickly now, but every time we would film together, we would get arrested. The survivors were being monitored by the military and simply were not allowed to be telling their story to a filmmaker. And one of the survivors said, Josh, it's imperative, it's essential that you not quit, it's essential that you show what happened and you show the nature of the regime of fear and terror that's built on the celebration of genocide under which we are all living. But the way to do that safely without getting arrested, and so you're able to actually film something, is to film the perpetrators. They live all around us. I was living in a small village with them at the time. They will boast, they will show off about what they've done, they will appear to be proud of what they've done. Film that, and the audience will see exactly why we're so afraid. That's what this woman with whom I was trying to make a film about the survivor's experience said. And indeed, every perpetrator I filmed was open and was offering to take me to the places they killed, show me how they did it. And the film, the whole process, you could say, is a response to that openness. So I didn't have to convince them to be open. The openness is the raison d'être for the act of killing, for this film. So what I told them was very simple. I said, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. Your whole society is based on it. Your lives are shaped by it. I want to know what it means to you. You want to show me what you've done. Show me what you've done. In whatever way you wish, I will film the process. I'll help you make your dramatizations exactly what you want them to be to the best of my abilities, as I was instructed by Makaveyev. And together, we will put this material together and create essentially a new form of documentary, a documentary of the imagination rather than a documentary of everyday life. And that will show what this means to you and to your society. And that's what we did. That's what we did. And I think it's interesting to look at what the characters, how the characters are using the film. We can talk about that too in a moment. How I think no one's really trying to glorify what they've done, actually, in the film. I think they all have more complicated and more human reasons for participating.
But what I wanted to ask you a little bit about is ethics, the ethics of the documentary filmmaker. And in relation to ethics, I would particularly like to ask you about this scene. And I don't even want to assume that it's real, because we know that the whole tradition of documentary filmmaking with things that are staged. But I'm very, very curious to know your opinion on ethics in this particular scene where these gangsters, as they call themselves, are going around to the Chinese shopkeepers and sort of extorting them for money, whether they really are or not, or whether they really did or not. I wanted to ask you what's sort of your ethical stance in this particular scene, I guess, is sort of an example of some of the larger things that you're dealing with in the film. How did you come to grips with directing and or participating in this scene or song?
That's a good question. The scene where it was a painful scene to shoot, to contemplate shooting. We understood that Herman and Safi, that those are the two men going around extorting people with their lower level goons, that's how they earn a living. And they said, kind of in their moment of trying to show how powerful and tough they are as gangsters, they said, don't you want to film that? And we talked about it, me and my crew, and discussed, should we film this? And it was kind of me having doubts, and all of the Indonesian crew saying, absolutely, you have to film this because this happens every day in our society and we can never film this.
Otherwise it would be ethical cleansing.
Yeah, otherwise it would be ethical cleansing. And so then, no, I'm too tired, I'll just repeat anything you say without thinking about what you're saying. I was up at 4 in the morning to be here with you today. So I think you just put words in my mouth. So it was so basically the crew was saying, you must film this, Josh. Now you actually have a responsibility to film this because you have the chance to film this. And this will be important for the whole Indonesian-Chinese community, Chinese-Indonesian community. And filming it was, of course, terrible, so I devised, even the prospect of filming it was terrible, so I devised an excuse where I told Herman and Safi, after they go to the next person, wait for the cameras to catch up with you, I'm going to just stay back and get a release form signed. That was a ruse so that I could actually explain to the Chinese shopkeepers why we were there. We had to think a lot about that too, because that put me and my crew in some risk to give that information out. But I felt so awful about filming people. I guess the risk that I felt was that these people would now think Safi and Herman and the gangsters are so powerful that they have their own TV crew following them, and they have such power and impunity that they'll do this on television, and that would make them more afraid. So I didn't feel they weren't being extorted for the camera. That was something that these two men do every day, but apart from when they're making my film. But I felt it was somehow important to explain why we were there, and it was also, I felt, important to pay them back. So it was actually a very expensive scene to film for a seemingly simple observational scene. I didn't persuade him to play the victim. In fact, that's one of the more interesting things in the film. Anwar is playing the victim from the very beginning. So if you see the scene where Anwar's dancing on the roof at the beginning, that in fact was the first first time I ever filmed with Anwar. He said, let me take you to where, fine, come over tomorrow, we'll film together, I'll show you where I killed people, and that's what happened. And if you notice when he's dancing on the roof, he has a piece of wire on his neck. That's because after he shows me, which you see, how he killed, he then said, now you have to see how the victims died. And he sat down and played the victim. And it's not the first time, that's not the only other time in the film where he plays the victim. He's playing the victim in the rubber plantation late at night. He's playing both killer and victim there. He does the same when he's in his nightmare scenario where his head is cut off. I think there's sort of two issues. I think Anwar was compelled to play the victim because for him, making the fiction scenes was a way of actually not, it wasn't a therapeutic process, at least not by intent, neither of us intended it to be. He intended it to be, I think, unconsciously, if you can have an unconscious intention, he was trying to run away from his pain somehow. He was trying to use the filmmaking process in the same way that he used Elvis Presley movies to distance himself from the horror of what he's done, to replace the miasmic terror that would visit him every night in his nightmares with something relatively safe and contained and concrete in these fiction scenes. And I think it's almost like he was building up a sort of psychic, cinematic psychic scar tissue over the wound. And of course, if you kill people with wire, as he says to Adi, you have to watch them die, apart from this one scene, peculiar time where he's under the table, which scene I think he only did once. And if you watch someone die, and it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes each time, it's really gruesome. He told about how people would die, it was awful. And that must be the image that haunts him, and the image he somehow has to deal with. So I think he's actually trying to escape from his pain, to convince himself that if he can make a beautiful family movie about mass killing, as he says in the film, then he can somehow make it okay for himself. And I think I was filming these reenactments of mass killing and their glorification of mass killing as a way of exposing, first and foremost, a regime of impunity. What happens when no one's held to account, when nothing is forbidden? And I was doing that on behalf of a community of survivors who were my friends, with whom I had been living, and who we were together, with whom we were arrested whenever we tried to film. So I was sort of doing the work of expose, and he was doing the work of running away, and that tension, I think, between our projects is maybe the real motor in the film. And I just say one other thing about it. I know I'm rambling and giving you a long answer, but I think that Anwar, I think that in a sense, Anwar's celebration of genocide seems to be a symptom of his lack of remorse. So he feels no remorse, otherwise he couldn't possibly celebrate this. I think that's wrong. I think that if any of us had killed, if we had killed, if we had the chance and to justify it to ourselves, we would, Because otherwise you have to deal with being a killer. You have to wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, I'm a killer, I've destroyed people, I've destroyed other human beings. If you're given the opportunity to justify it, you will, just as Adi says in the film, killing is the worst thing you can do, but do it if you want to, if you're paid well enough, but then have a good excuse. We will justify if we can. And so what appears to, and if you don't quite believe your justification, justification becomes celebration. So propaganda and celebration are the same thing. So if we look at, so what appears to be a symptom of their lack of remorse is in fact the opposite, I think. And that's the paradox in the film. But the tragedy of that is that once you've corrupted yourself by killing, then having killed one person, if you are given the opportunity to kill again, it's like you almost have to do it in order to prove that it was okay the first time. Otherwise, you're admitting that it was wrong the first time. And so you have to somehow come up with a way, if you want to understand this kind of behavior, murder, for example, killing, using film, you have to come up with a way to understand why people killed the first time. And here it was all about power and money, and then the killers become addicted to justification for their own conscience, and the tragedy to convince themselves that they were right. And the tragedy is that that demands further evil. That becomes a cover for committing further evil, for corruption, for extorting your victims, for stealing their land, and for killing again. I was asked a very eloquent question that I will not be able to repeat with such eloquence, but you asked, if I understood you correctly, that the process of wound healing involves Anwar's building up of a scar tissue. I wouldn't say it's a healing. I think he's not healed anything at the end. But that's cinematic. And the wound making, both the killing and I guess the layering on of fake wounds, is also cinematic. And the making of the film is cinematic. Was I thinking about this blurring of the boundaries between the real and the cinematic in our sort of in the performance of violence, both real violence and fake violence? Yeah, absolutely, I was thinking about that. I think that first of all, I think that we are fascinated by fake violence. So violence, we are fascinated by violence, and that fascination. We go and we pay money to go to cinemas and watch people get their heads blown off in beautiful ways with nice lighting. And that is something about us that's fascinating. As children, maybe when we don't know better, or if a fight breaks out on the playground, we run over and scream, fight, 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 enjoying watching another human being get hurt, be hurt. I think we're the only species that has that fascination with violence. And maybe our socialization process is about the layering on of fantasies. So we imagine, we first of all create fake violence where the real referent, the real thing that's depicted is absent, as in a movie, as in an action movie. And we also commit real violence, but absent ourselves somehow, right? We tell ourselves that we make ourselves absent, either by getting drunk, as in many of the perpetrators I met before Anwar, who were in the countryside, or by watching movies like Anwar did, or by sitting behind a computer console launching a drone attack. That's a good way of distancing yourself from the act of killing. Killing is reduced to video game, and we are all familiar with playing video games. We've been playing them since we're children. So I think that the place in the film, or maybe the key thing that we do in the film that hopefully draws some of your attention to that in a hopefully sickening way, and in a way that makes you uncomfortable with yourself, with ourselves, is the fact that here we have cinematic violence where the real world referent thing in the world is in every frame, because it's the real killer and it's in the real place and there's real trauma. And so instead it's aestheticized movie violence, but the real thing is also there somehow, haunting each frame. And that I think is maybe the key innovation in the act of killing, and it's a perverse innovation. And it's interestingly an innovation that Anwar intuits will be a selling point, because he says earlier in the film, why do people watch movies about the Nazis? To see power and sadism. And there's so many movies, and he's right about that. And there's movies where we see people get their there's many movies where people get their heads blown off, he said, or have their heads cut off, he says, but that's fiction. But I did it in real life, and that's going to make this film so interesting for audiences. And the fact that he's right about that. Why is this film successful in terms of the interest it's arousing around the world beyond my wildest expectations? Because Anwar was right about that. Because that is really fascinating. And it's not just a thought experiment, it's not just a perverse experiment. It is a way of making us think about how we use storytelling and fiction to not look at real violence, and also how we perpetrate, how we are fascinated with the suffering of others. I will say something that I'll say where the film has had the most profoundly unexpected impact, and that's in Indonesia itself. The film can't be legally screened in Indonesia because there's still political film censorship. It can be openly, publicly screened in festivals or in cinemas. So in order to do that, you would have to submit the film to the censorship board, and then they would likely ban the film. And if they ban the film, it becomes a crime to screen the film. And if it's a crime to screen the film, that becomes an excuse for the paramilitary group or the army to attack screenings physically. And that would be terrible. So to get around that, we held screenings throughout the autumn for Indonesia's leading journalists, human rights advocates, filmmakers, artists, historians, writers, and they universally, I can say universally in fact, loved the film. And we started writing about the film, but also about the genocide in really in-depth ways in the mainstream media for the first time in 47 years. They were so upset, so alarmed, that they said, we simply cannot pretend this doesn't exist. We have to write about it.